morning.
Good morning.
Just jumping right in. It's been almost 62 years since George Harrison joined John Lennon and Paul McCartney as one of the Quarrymen, creating the foundation of what has become known as the greatest band on earth, the Beatles. But with birth also comes death. Over the past 60-plus years, the untimely death of the Fab Four has been predicted over and over again, whether it was the end of boy bands, pop music, guitar bands, rock and roll, or the Beatles themselves. In this presentation, I will explore all the ways the Beatles as a band have survived these predictions of their untimely disbanding. August 17, 1960, the Beatles arrived in Hamburg and would for the first time, where they would play 48 consecutive nights at the Indra and 56 nights at the Kaiserkeller. 11 weeks in, on November 2nd, George Harrison would be deported for being underage. He was just 17. 3 weeks after George left, the Beatles' residency came to a quick halt after Paul McCartney and Pete Best were arrested for supposed arson on November 29, 1960, and deported the next day, leaving John Lennon alone in Hamburg.
Hamburger works.
John didn't leave Hamburg until December 10, 1960. By then, he was feeling down and confused. I just withdrew to think whether it was worth going on. I thought, is this what I want to do? I was always a sort of poet or painter, and I thought, is this it? Nightclubs, and seedy scenes, being deported, and weird people in clubs? Nowadays they call it decadence, but those days it was just in Hamburg, in clubs that groups played at, strip clubs. I thought hard about whether I should continue. But 5 days later, John got back in touch with his bandmates, who were anxious to pick up where they had left off. The Beatles were up and running again, and it wouldn't be long before they would sign a contract with their new manager, Brian Epstein. On January 1st, 1962, the Beatles, along with their manager, Brian Epstein, and roadie Neil Aspinall, drove to London on New Year's Eve, 1961, to audition for Decca Records next day. They would record a total of 15 songs. Several weeks later, they would learn that Decca was taking a pass on signing them, and the words of Dick Rowe would live in infamy. Guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein. The Beatles have no future in show business. If Rowe had been correct, Beatles would have ended in early 1962, but instead, our boys fought on. August 18th, 1962. Brian Epstein fired Pete Best at the request of his bandmates after being told that the producer, George Martin, was not too keen on their drummer. 2 days later, on August 18th, Ringo would perform at the local Horticultural Society's 17th annual dance at Hulme Hall in Port Sunland for the first time as a Beatle. But the next night, at the Cavern Club, after word had gotten out that Pete Best had been sacked, the fans would delay the start of the show by chanting, "Ringo never, Pete Best forever." Ian Edwards of Ian and the Zodiacs was quoted as saying, they were shouting, "Ringo out, Pete in," and refusing to let them play. There was a big question as to whether this could be the Beatles' downfall. Everyone was talking about it. Once again, the boys would survive, sign with EMI, and Beatlemania would take over the world. It wasn't long after conquering America with our first tour that other cities and countries started banning the Beatles. The reasons would vary, from the inability to control a horde of rabid teenagers to Israel's reasoning that their current calendar of artists performing that summer were of, and I quote, far greater artistic value and importance than the Beatles. Unfortunately for these naysayers, teenage girls were much stronger-willed, and they would risk hide and hair to see them. With the history of pop music being that one moment you're on top, the next moment you're a nobody, It wasn't long before the press and record companies started looking at the next big act to knock the Beatles off the top of the charts. On September 10, 1964, the Post-Star of Glen Falls, New York, was quoting a British Beatles magazine as saying that the Fab Four, quote, have been displaced in popularity by the Rolling Stones, quote, unquote, and who, quote, wear their hair longer than the Beatles, unquote. The article goes on to say, even more depressing, perhaps, is the news that the Beatles have been topped on the hit parade in England by an outfit called the Kinks. The Kinks are Beatles in pink riding coats. But we all know that being knocked off and other bands coming up couldn't touch our Beatles. The article behind this headline came out of London and was picked up by newspapers across the United States. According to the reporter, concert promoters actually held a crisis meeting to try to figure out why ticket sales were sluggish for beat groups. A national survey was done. Its conclusion was, quote, British teenagers are getting bored with beat music, but they still buy records by the Beatles and similar groups for want of something better. My opinion would be that, basically these are a bunch of silly grown-ups, and that we all know that the Beatles were the something better, not dying off like they, the press, were trying to prove. Kids couldn't afford to invest in other bands after saving up and buying Beatles records, concert tickets, and tchotchkes. The Beatles made $25 million in 1964, which translates to almost $188 million today. In March of 1965, in an interview with British reporter by the name of Maureen Cleave, John Lennon made the infamous quote, "Beatles are more popular than Jesus." But when the story was picked up by the American press in August, things turned ugly for the boys right before their fall tour of the U.S. was to begin. Multiple radio stations across the country banned the Beatles from the airwaves. They and the churches announced Beatles bonfires, burned fans' records, books, and trinkets to boycott the Beatles and to drive them away. Brian Epstein would rush to the States to try to calm down the furor prior to the start of the tour, which was due to begin August 19th in San Francisco. John Lennon would be forced to issue an apology, but the truth was, people picketing and boycotting concerts still couldn't compete with the legion of fans attending the concerts and buying albums. But there were adults who understood what Lennon was trying to say, as proven by this interview with a pastor from a Lutheran church in Chester Springs, PA, in September 1966. He says, "Can you possibly imagine 50,000 teenagers saving up and begging for permission to pay $5 to go to church?" The Beatles would survive, but Lennon learned a valuable lesson about the press. After having survived an angry mob scene in the Philippines in July 1966 and the Bigger Than Jesus debacle in August of that same year, the Beatles finally announced that they had had enough of touring after their final concert at Candlestick Park on August 29, 1966. This would not only send their fans into a frenzy, but it would also start rumors that the Beatles were finished as a band because of them each pursuing their individual interests that year. McCartney would say, "Why should we? We're each other's best friends. We never said we were splitting up. Other people said it about us. But it's not true." On August 27, 1967, Beatles manager Brian Epstein died of an accidental overdose of alcohol and pills. The man who had discovered them, dressed them, taught them how to bow and how to behave on stage. The man who took care of all their financial and business dealings was now gone. Could they survive without him? I knew that we were in trouble then. I didn't really have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music. I was scared. I thought, we fucking had it. Quote by John. Survive they did, but things would never be the same. There would be major disagreements and tensions from this point. 1 year later, on August 22nd, 1968, tired of the tension in the studio during the recording of the White Album, Ringo abruptly quit the band. He borrowed his friend Peter Sellers' yacht and sailed to Sardinia with Maureen and his sons. As far as he was concerned, he was no longer a Beatle. It was during this trip that he wrote Octopus's Garden. 2 weeks in, he received a postcard from John, Paul, and George saying, "You're the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come home. We love you." He would return on September 3rd to find his drums in the studio covered in flowers. Now, anybody that was out late last night to watch Mark Lewison's presentation, I did ask him afterwards because I consulted a couple sources on this, but he claims he does not believe that Ringo went to Sardinia on the boat when he quit, that it happened in the October afterwards. So, I don't want to argue with Mark Lewison, but my sources, including the Beatle Bible and the book Little Help, both say he went to Sardinia. So we'll wait till Mark Lewison's book and see if he thinks I'm right. But I think he's going to stick by his story. I'm sure he knows better. So there's a quote from Ringo: "I'm leaving the group because I'm not playing well and I feel unloved and out of it, and you three are really close." Just got up, said it to each one of them, and walked out. January 10th, 1969. 5 months later, after several frustrating and argumentative days of recording and being filmed at Twickenham Studios, George Harrison thought to himself, "What's the point of this? I'm quite capable of being relatively happy on my own, and I'm not able to be happy in this situation. I'm getting out of here." His last words were, "See you around the clubs," he said, and walked out. 2 days later, the four members would meet up at Ringo's to try to resolve the differences, but to no avail. George refused to come back, and the band went on recording without him. It wasn't until January 15th they came to an agreement and returned to the recording studio, but this time at Seville Road. It was during George's walkout that he would write the song Wah Wah. And now on to the obvious, the Paul is dead rumors. The first known article about the Paul is dead rumor appeared on September 17, 1969 in Drake Times Delphic, the student newspaper of Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. The article, "Is Beatle Paul McCartney Dead?" addressed the rumors that had been circulating around campus about Paul's untimely death in a car accident in November 1966 and him being replaced with a look-alike. I could go on and on about all the clues the fans supposedly found on the covers of Sgt. Pepper's and Abbey Road albums, but that's another lecture for another day. Suffice to say, Paul is alive and well and still with us to this day. And that's the picture that appeared on Life magazine when he said, no, I'm fine. He was just in hiding up at his farm in Scotland. On April 10, 1970, Paul McCartney made headlines when he announced that he was quitting the Beatles, much to the surprise of his bandmates, and especially John Lennon, who had already told Alan Klein on September 12th he was leaving, and reiterated it to the band on September 20th. Lennon was told to keep the news under wraps for a while until they signed a new contract with the EMI. But the real nail in the coffin for the end of the Beatles would come in another 4 years. What you're seeing here is Paul and George signing the papers on, this is the Plaza Hotel in New York City, December 19th, 1974. John refused to show up. He said it wasn't in the stars. It wasn't a good day astrologically for him to do it. Ringo had already signed them. In England prior, he was on the phone, alive and well. He had to be there in some form, so he was on the phone while this. So on December 29th, papers were taken down to Florida where John Lennon was with May Pang, and he was the last signature, and the Beatles, the fans' biggest fear had come true. The Beatles were dead. Their only hope was that someday they may reunite. As we all waited, hoping our boys could put their differences aside, shots rang out on the night of December 8, 1980. John Lennon was dead, and so were our dreams of the Beatles reuniting. Never again would they sing or appear together. The Beatles were dead until December 12, 1995, when the remaining 3 Beatles released Free as a Bird, an unfinished song by John Lennon that was given to them to complete by Yoko Ono. We all rejoiced at the feeling that our Beatles had been resurrected. It was a gift from beyond. But our dream wouldn't end there. On March 4th, 1996, George, Paul, and Ringo released Real Love, in which they all once again overdubbed themselves onto an old John Lennon demo. Unfortunately, this would be the last official release by the Beatles, and everything would come crashing down in November 2001. The dream was finally over. After 4 years of on and off battling with cancer, George Harrison died. Now only 2 Beatles remain, with just one more song left by John Lennon. The song, Now and Then, was one of the songs given to McCartney by Yoko Ono in the 1990s. According to Jeff Lynne, who was producing the tracks, they spent a day and a half working on the song, decided to ditch it for Real Love. Whether or not George actually contributed to Now and Then, whether vocals or guitar, has never been disclosed, so it remains to be seen. Until then, our hopes are high that someday we could actually hear the Fat Four together again. Until then, the Beatles will forever remain alive and well in our hearts. And for some of us, a little longer. And if you've seen Scott Erickson this weekend, this is his brand new tattoo that he just got a week ago.
Thank you.